It's so nice to see so many people here. This is like the old days when I had to be the meanie and tell you to stop schmoozing. It's not really, I hate that job. I want you to schmooze. Tonight, I am thinking about our member, Michael Balin, and his father. Michael's father lives in Odessa in Ukraine, quite elderly, and is more afraid of the harrowing journey it would take to leave Ukraine than he is to stay where he is. So our hearts are with Michael and his family and all those like Michael's father. Tonight I'm thinking of Waldemar and his family. Waldemar is a new member of our congregation. His family lives in Gdańsk in Poland, and in Poland they have taken in 6 or 8, maybe it's more. 6 members of the family and 6 refugees now living in their home. And those two extremes kind of describe where I am right now in this moment. I know that most of you know that I took a journey in the past week together with 17 other rabbis from the tri-state area. I'm grateful to UJA Federation for inviting me to join that journey. The 18 of us traveled to Poland to witness the terrible tragedy unfolding there and the extraordinary acts of generosity that are also happening on the Polish side of the border, to bring supplies that you all provided, to bring spiritual comfort where we could to refugees and those who are seeking to offer aid, and to come back and to share what we saw with all of you. Not only so that you can be proud of us, but so that we can together hold each other accountable not to avert our eyes when the news cycle changes, as it will. I'm so appreciative of the prayers that so many of you offered to me before I left, and then on the journey, I felt like I was carrying all of your prayers with me, and I'm grateful. And having made it back to this side of jet lag, I feel moved to say Gomel, which is a blessing we say when we've made it through a journey. So even if you didn't go to a war zone this week, if you feel like you've been through a thing, I invite you to join me, whatever that is. I invite you to join me in saying this blessing, Baruch atah Adonai, Gomel Chasadim Tovim. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, sovereign of the universe, who has bestowed every goodness upon us. I'm aware that when we got on the plane, it's a bunch of rabbis. There's all these prayers we have to say. Oh, my God. And, of course, we said Tefillat HaDerech, traveler's prayer. And something struck me in the Tefillat HaDerech this time that had never quite struck me in the same way before. The prayer talks about praying that we go out in peace and return in peace. And we were just acutely aware that we were leaving a place of safety. And we were, even though my mom was worried, and I think my mom's watching, we were sure we were coming back to a place of safety. We were confident that would be the case. But the people we were going to see were leaving a place of crisis and lack of safety without any assurance that they would ever go back to a place of safety, and even if they went home again, whether it would ever look like home again. So there were all these dichotomies that we carried with us as we headed out on our journey. And also being rabbis, we were looking for the Jewish in everything, as you can imagine. And we were entering this journey in the week leading up to Purim. And I know many of you celebrated Purim with us over the last week. And it occurred to me that there were 3 themes in the Megillah that kind of overlaid and overlapped with our experience in Poland over about 48 hours. Number 1, the Megillah affirms that there is evil in the world. Number 2, the Megillah affirms that even though sometimes it comes from unexpected places, there is also good in the world. And lastly, the Megillah affirms that neither good nor evil are inevitable. And as I've been thinking about what I would say to you tonight, that's where the journey I want to take you on. There is evil in the world, real evil. Now, that word evil gets thrown around a lot. Someone who disagrees with me politically is evil. Someone who voted the wrong way is evil. Cub fans are evil. Well, they might actually be. Just saying. But there is, even though that term is overused, and it is overused, there is real evil in the world. And the Megillah teaches us that. And this moment in Ukraine teaches us that. You've seen the images. You didn't need to get on a plane to see images of Vladimir Putin bombing civilian centers and a theater that he knew was a shelter for children. There have been thousands dead and millions more exiled from their homes. It is indeed an evil humanitarian disaster of epic proportions inside and outside of Ukraine. On our journey, we stood at the border crossing at Medyka, one of 8 border crossings between Poland and Ukraine, and witnessed lots of strollers come by and a very little bit of luggage and no men other than some elderly men, because men who are between age 18 and 60 are required by law to stay in Ukraine and fight. So this is a refugee crisis of women and children and the elderly. Many of the people that we met had been on a journey of 4 or 5 or 6 days to get from their hometown to the border, which might just explain why so many people are hesitant to leave, because they fear the journey as much as they fear Vladimir Putin. It was about 50 degrees the day that we were on the border, but the day before it had been in the 20s. And people who had made a 4 or 5 or 6 day journey had to wait for 48 hours to try and cross the border, and 6 people had died of hypothermia on the other side of the border. They had made it all the way to the border, and they died waiting to come into Poland. In the eyes of the refugees, we saw terror and trauma and sadness and despair and grief and loss and doubts about whether they would ever see their partners and spouses again. We witnessed Polish volunteers and soldiers come halfway across no man's land with shopping carts to gather up the little kids and whatever luggage was coming across the way, and to help people come to the Polish side of the border. And when the refugees came across the border to the Polish side, the first thing they encountered was a tent with an Israeli flag on the top. It was the first tent in a whole line of tents on either side of this path of NGOs and humanitarian organizations providing all kinds of things that people would need when they crossed to the other side. These people were not sure whether they would ever see their loved ones again, and for what. We went from there, together with the refugees, from the border to a transit center, we were told. We walked up, it looked kind of like, I don't know, a Costco or a Walmart or something, not a big store, but something like that. We didn't know what we were walking into when we walked inside, and we realized we were in a mall. So picture whatever your favorite mall. But the jewelry store didn't have jewelry in it anymore. It was all cleared out, and inside the jewelry store was a medical center. And the toy store had been transformed into a legal aid and passport center. And another store was where some social workers were sitting and trying to bring comfort. And the food hall had been taken over by World Kitchen to try and feed everybody that was there. And there were just cots everywhere, just lining the stores and lining the hallways of the mall. And people there were just not sure where they were going to go, not sure what was next for them. There were volunteers everywhere trying to provide for them and trying to take care of them and trying to make sure they had what they need just to survive. People went from there, if they went at all, to the train station, and we went with them in Przemysl. And we learned that for the first couple of weeks, the people who left Ukraine In general, not always, but in general, they left because they had places to go. They had people in other places. They had directions. They had somewhere to go. And now, 2 or 3 weeks into the crisis, people are just fleeing without a direction at all. So we witnessed there in the train station, look, some people want to stay near the border. They want to go home. They don't want to start a new life anywhere else. They want to stay in Western Ukraine, which is now more dangerous than it was before, or they want to stay in Eastern Poland. They'd like to stay close so they can go home again. Other people are trying to start a new life, perhaps in Poland. And while we were there, the Polish government passed a law saying that Ukrainian refugees could stay for 18 months and work if they needed to, and that was very good. And other people want to start a new life somewhere else, but they don't know where to go. So there in the train station, of the many things we saw, was a big table covered with a map of Europe. And I don't speak Ukrainian or Polish or Russian, but you could tell there were volunteers on one side of the table and refugees on the other side. And what was happening, it seemed, was that the volunteers were trying to explain, if you get on this train, this is where you'll end up. If you get on this train, this is where you'll end up. And I was trying to imagine what it would be like, not only to flee from a place of danger, but flee to a place where I didn't know where it was, where I didn't know what I would find there, where I would be alone when I got there. Some people were, among our people, among the Jewish people, were seeking to make Aliyah. In all of 2021, about 3,000 Ukrainians made Aliyah to Israel. In the last 2 weeks, almost 2,500 people have made Aliyah. We actually met Ukrainians on Monday, who on Tuesday, we then saw them off on their bus to the airport to make Aliyah to Israel. So people are finding places both to stay in Poland and hospitality, as I'll say more about in a minute, and they're also seeking to leave where they can. I was thinking the other night, Cantor, as you chanted from the Megillah, that we get to this part late in the story where Haman's children's names are there, his sons' names. And Cantor, in keeping with tradition, not because he was out of breath or because he wanted to end the spiel early, but because that's the tradition, Cantor rushes through the names of Haman's children. And why do we that? I think it's because we're embarrassed, right? We won and we got to defeat those who wanted to defeat us, but we're embarrassed by that. It's like a Quentin Tarantino film where we get to take revenge, or maybe we're afraid the non-Jews will see us celebrating the downfall of evil. But there is evil. There's real evil. Not just in the Purim story, but now. And we have to drown it out. Not just then, but now. The Megillah reminds us to a degree about the ironies of life. There's a sense of humor about the Megillah. How sometimes stories end in a way that you didn't expect. And that there can be good people and good outcomes, even in situations that you might not anticipate. In the 9th chapter of the Megillah, it says, on the 13th day of the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, when the king's command and decree were to be executed, the very day on which the enemies of the Jews had expected to get them with their power, the text says in Hebrew, v'na'afochu, the opposite happened. And the Jews defeated their enemies with their power. V'na'afochu. Sometimes the opposite happens. There's been an outpouring of support for Ukraine and for Ukrainian refugees. Some of it is not a surprise. The fact that members of Shari Tefillah brought inside of about 48 hours thousands of pounds of supplies for Ukraine, not a surprise. I could only bring about 350 pounds of those supplies. I'd say it was about 10% of what you all brought. The nursery school told the kids not where I was going, but they told the kids that I was going to help kids. And the kids painted pictures and cards, and I brought them with me, and I delivered them, and they made bags for people. And you all were amazingly generous. And yesterday, a few of us took the other 90% of what you donated so far down to St. George's Church at 7th and Ukrainian Church at 7th Avenue and 30th Street. And I was told this afternoon that all of that is on a plane right now to Ukraine. So it doesn't surprise me that you were generous, and I hope that you'll continue to be generous. And there's been other kinds of generosity, some from you as well, from those who gave to the World Union for Progressive Judaism to protect and to strengthen our progressive Reformed congregations in Ukraine, of which there's at least 10, and the UJA, of course, and the AFIA Foundation that we're continuing to work with that can get supplies, especially critically needed medical supplies, directly into Ukraine. We encourage you to support these organizations and many, many others. If you have your pet organizations that you're supporting, please do. I'm recommending these. We each, in addition to what you gave, we each were carrying bags from AFIA, which is this amazing organization that responds to crisis. And what's inside those bags was tourniquets and burn kits and suture trays and all kinds of things that are needed in a war zone. And we brought about 28 of those bags, and those bags went right into Ukraine, right into Lviv the day after we were there. So generosity came, and goodness came from all of you and from so many other places. I couldn't help but think while I was there about Fiddler on the Roof. I think Anatevka is a made-up place, but it takes place in what's called the Pale of Settlement, what my grandmother called Russia, Poland. Now I know what that actually is, Russia, Poland. Probably in Ukraine. Remember the end of the story? Right? 130 years ago, many of our Jewish ancestors, including mine, were terrorized and killed and kicked out by Cossacks, a group of predominantly East Slavic Orthodox Christian people who became known as members of democratic, self-governing, semi-military communities originating in the steppes of Eastern Europe along the Dnieper River that runs through modern-day Ukraine. The refugees we met, the refugees that you brought supplies for, the refugees that we are losing sleep over, the refugees that the world is waking up to, being concerned about, are proud descendants of the Cossacks. How do I know that? It's not just my assertion. Have you read the words of the Ukrainian national anthem? This is the last line of the Ukrainian national anthem. And we'll show that we brothers are of the Cossack nation. V'na'afochu. Everything's been turned on its head like it happens in the Megillah. Sometimes stories have surprise endings. We, descendants of people who were kicked out by the Cossacks, are now helping people who are fleeing, Cossacks, who are fleeing oppression. I was wondering what our Ukrainian ancestors might say. I'd like to think they'd be proud that Judaism was still alive. I'd like to think that they would be surprised by what we're doing and what's going on now. And I'd like to think that they were proud that we remember our history but don't feel stuck in our history. That we don't feel like we have to hold an endless grudge against the second and the third and the fourth generation. And what would our Polish ancestors say about the incredible generosity and hospitality of the Polish people being shown right now? Not something we Jews experienced a lot of. Perhaps you remember. Everywhere, Poles were showing up, bringing trays of food that they had just cooked. They didn't go to the store and buy stuff. They cooked it and brought it to the border and to the transit center and the train station. People making box lunches to bring for people to take on the train wherever they go. We met a couple at the border who is helping with response. What they did before 2 weeks ago is they run an Airbnb, little Airbnb. And they realized they might know something about hospitality. And they know a whole bunch of people who run Airbnbs throughout that whole area near Przemysl. And so they called all their friends, and they are marshaling people to welcome refugees into their homes. And we met another guy what he does for a living is he runs music festivals, big music festivals. He knows something about feeding lots of people and making sure that people have a place to stay. And he's taken a break from his work and is helping out. Story after story after story like this of Polish people opening their hearts and opening their homes and giving what they can. We were told that the mayor of this little town, Przemysl, had a reputation as not being particularly welcoming of strangers before all this. But we met with him, and he has opened the halls of the municipality, the municipal building, for people to sleep and stay. And he's marshaling whatever he can. Sometimes everything gets turned on its head, and you can find goodness in the most unlikely places. The third theme that resonated with us throughout the trip, we were reminded that when we, at the end of the Megillah, when we survived, one of the mitzvot of Purim is to send gifts to the poor. So all of you who did that in the last week, you did it for Ukraine and you did it for your Jewish tradition. And you responded so generously. And we are going to continue to collect things, at least for the next 2 weeks. And I'm proud, and you should be, I know you are too, that we welcomed an Iraqi family into this country and helped them settle a couple of years ago, and we soon will help settle another refugee family, and we should be proud of that work. Really proud. And the United States and the United Nations and much of the world has responded so generously in this moment of crisis, and we should be proud, really proud. And here's the Zets portion of the program. Poland has opened its doors. 2 weeks ago, 38 million people lived in Poland. Today, 40 million people lived in Poland. They've added 10% to their population in 2 weeks. Other European countries are now opening their gates to the millions of refugees fleeing Ukraine. The Biden administration is not allowing any Ukrainian refugees to come to this country so far. We have to ask ourselves why. And more. When African refugees were fleeing, as they have over the last few years, Europe's response then was, sorry, we're full. When refugees were fleeing what our former president called S-hole countries, the US said, we have no more room. When a month ago, and I didn't know this story until we were in Poland, one of the workers at the JCC in Warsaw told us this story. When a month ago, a group of Syrian refugees tried to cross the border from Belarus to Poland, Poland said, we're not letting you in. And there was no outcry from the world. I mean, we didn't know that story. Nobody was collecting supplies for those refugees. No one was giving money or advocating for those people. There was no offer of help. My friends, we should help the people that we're helping now. Please don't get me wrong. We should help the people and continue to help and be proud of our efforts and invite other people to join us. And we need to ask ourselves the hard question about why we're moved to help certain people and maybe not other people as well. There's a famous debate between Hillel and Shammai, two great teachers from the first century who had competing schools of study in Israel. And it's said in the Talmud, for 2.5 years, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel disagreed about this question. Should God have created humanity? Those are rabbis who have way too much time on their hands, but they asked this question because they had seen so much evil in their world, in their lifetime. And they were debating this seriously. And Shammai says it would have been preferable for humanity not to have been created, because then there would be less evil in the world. And Hillel said it is preferable that man was created. And the debate raged, and this is one of the only cases where in the end, they decided that Shammai was right. You all know, I know, that Hillel and Shammai are always debating, and almost always Hillel wins. In the end, they agree maybe it would have been better for humanity not to have been created. It's such a pessimistic view. But in moments of difficulty, when we see humanity's inhumanity towards other humanity, we might tend to agree. But that wasn't the end of the rabbinic discussion. It never is. The debate continued through the generations. And Rambam picks this up in the Middle Ages, and he lifts up the rabbinic argument that sees human nature as half and half, balanced between good and evil. Within every person, within every collective of people, Rambam says, within individuals and families and congregations and cities and states and nations, is an ongoing struggle. There is within us a yetzer tov, a good and generous inclination towards taking care of ourselves and others and not seeing that as an either or. And there is also within all of us a yetzer ra, a selfish, it's all about me. Those people should pull themselves up by their bootstraps inclination. We all have that within us as well. And the two clash constantly. There's evil in the world, and there is good, and neither is inevitable. So as we make our way from Purim to Passover, as human beings with all of our inclinations, let us recommit ourselves to ensuring that all peoples can sing songs of freedom, that we will not allow evil to stand, that having so often been the refugee, that we will not rest while any refugees roam the earth, that we will turn this emotion we feel to acts of redemption, that we will ensure that everyone can find a sanctuary when they need one, so that good will always triumph over evil. Shabbat Shalom.